So it gives me the greatest pleasure to welcome you to this press conference. I'm going to hand you over to Ross Butler, and it's Ross who heads up the Children's Union who are facilitating this press conference. Ross.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome. I'm one of the only non-senior medical professionals you're going to hear from today. I'm an informed and concerned parent, a dad. And during lockdown, I set up the Children's Union to protect children from careless policy. And one of the first people that I met through that was Dr. Ross Jones, a retired paediatrician who spent her entire career trying to protect children. And now she's spending her entire retirement trying to protect children. And then 2 weeks ago to the day, Ross mentioned that she was about to send a letter to the JCVI with 90 signatories, all of whom were senior medical experts, doctors, professors from the British medical establishment, calling for a pause to the rollout of the child's COVID vaccine. Well, when I read that letter, I was shocked at the content, but I was also deeply frustrated because there's all these brilliant minds and these medical experts, and they're just being ignored. And so I felt very strongly that whatever happened, we had to get the message out anyway, which is why we're here today and why we've invited all of you. Since then, Ross has formalised those original 90 signatures into the CCVAG, the Children's COVID Vaccine Advisory Group. And also since then, we thought, well, let's get a few more signatures on it. And in basically 8 working days, we've had 700 British health professionals co-sign that letter. These aren't just professors and doctors, they're also nurses and paramedics and people walking the wards and seeing what's happening out there. And they want us to get this information out there to parents and to young people. And so with your help today, that's what we're going to do. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the CCVAG panel chaired by Dr. Ross Jones. Ross.
Thank you very much, Ross. Well, I first just welcome to everybody here, and second, a huge thank you to Ross, because he's given up his entire website really over to doing this, and his entire life for the last 8 days or so. As a retired paediatrician, I signed up for work with the GMC back in April 2020, but actually they didn't need me, because what was very obvious early on was that the children's ward was eerily quiet, and they certainly didn't need retired paediatricians going back to work. So that was a blessing. So then I went back to retirement. But unfortunately, there have been many other problems for children from the pandemic management. So it was about a year ago that I first saw advertised on an evening BBC News recruitment for a children's vaccine in Oxford. They were recruiting children aged 5 to 15. And I was very shocked, because at that stage we had no long-term adult safety data at all. I contacted Professor Pollard, who's the professor leading the investigation and also coincidentally is chair of the JCVI. And I emailed him. I've known him through work, and he replied within the hour saying, "Oh, hi Ross, you're quite right. We don't know it's safe. That's why we're doing the study." He assured me it was a small pilot study, and if it was effective, then they would be looking to do a properly powered, full-size study. There's no way children will be receiving this vaccine within the year, he goes. And I thought, okay, but it was only 2 months after that Pfizer vaccine got its temporary authorization in the States. And that's when I wrote my first letter. We had about 60 of us on the first letter, I think. And really, we got that letter in before the MHRA had authorised it. They didn't reply. They didn't reply for 10 weeks, and we got a reply 2 hours after they had authorised the vaccine for children. We wrote again, because every time the letters replies are just very bland. They don't answer any of the individual questions that we've posed about potential safety signals for children. So I just thought I'd start with just reminding us of just some basics of how drug safety benefit works. You know, you have the top one, which is what you're wanting, where the disease is quite serious and the treatment has minimal side effects. I think we all understand that all drugs and treatments have potential side effects, but as long as the disease is worse than the cure, you've got a potentially useful drug. The next level down is where the disease more or less balances the cure, which is the sort of thing that you might be able to buy over the counter, but the NHS wouldn't be spending its money on. But at least it doesn't do you any harm. And of course the worst situation is the bottom one, where you've got a disease which is milder than the cure. And that's not a situation we want to be in. Now obviously quite a lot of drugs, when they're being developed, that may be discovered during the development phase and drugs never reach the market. But it's not uncommon for drugs to get to market where rarer side effects come to light, or perhaps delayed side effects that have not been picked up on the original trials. And when that happens, then a drug gets either withdrawn completely or really restricted in its use. So just a quick example, of course, would be AstraZeneca and the blood clots. At the beginning, we were told, oh no, 10 million doses and only 10 cases. But when you actually looked at it, there was a very strong age stratification, and it was then withdrawn for anybody under 40. So that was acting on a signal. But we turn now to Pfizer, and with the Pfizer, what seems to be the problem largely is myocarditis, and that is very much age-related. So we're in a situation where children have the least impact from COVID itself, but they have the most impact from potential side effects, particularly myocarditis. So in the US, 16 to 17-year-olds are the highest group, with an instance of 1 in 9,400 for this medication. Israel, they looked a bit more systematically. They were the first people to spot this problem. So from the moment they noticed it, they sent letters out to all their paediatricians, all their emergency departments, to tell them to look out for this. They found 1 in 6,230. So this is young men after their second dose of Pfizer. And it's interesting because their data, they looked at all age groups, and for the over 30s, it was 1 in 72,000. So there's a 10-fold difference in risk if you're over 30 versus under 20, but the COVID risk is 10-fold the other way. So your risk-benefit balance has changed by 100-fold by your age. So this mantra, safe and effective, is not fit for purpose. So Hong Kong, meanwhile, they've only started rolling out to children a bit later, by which time they knew about myocarditis, and they have looked systematically from the beginning of the programme, and they in fact decided to halt the second dose when they found 1 in 2,500 getting myocarditis. But that's just at the stage that we here went from 1 dose to 2 doses. It's described as mild and it goes away, but there have been child deaths reported in the States. I've personally been in Zoom calls with the group of cardiologists from the States who've been doing cardiac MRI scans, and they found that 89% of these children whose symptoms had gone had significant changes on the scans with swelling and potential scarring of heart muscle. And the JCVI, in the minutes of their meetings last summer, wanted to have 6 months to follow up that and see what's happened to those kids over time. But that was overruled, as we know. So that's what I've got to say for now. And I'd really like then to hand over to Claire, who's going to talk a bit more about the background to some of the death data we're concerned of. She's a diagnostic pathologist who has worked in the Genomes Project, working with the NHSE, and she's also co-chair of HEART. So over to you, Claire.
I just wanted to say a few words about the mortality data, because I think you've heard from Ross that because children are at such low risk from COVID, we're in a situation where there's very little benefit to them from the vaccine, and we've now got people in public health positions who are openly saying that the rationale for vaccinating children is a societal one. They're trying to reduce harm to others, not to the children. Which is problematic, especially when we know that these vaccines have very limited impact if any, on infections and transmission. So when you've got a vaccine where the benefit is not to the person you're giving it to, you need to be absolutely certain you're not causing harm. And we know that there are the problems of myocarditis, and we know that there are several other problems as well. Myocarditis is just one of the problems that we've been alerted to. So when looking at the whole, I think, well, let's just take a step back and see if we can see anything in the mortality data, because obviously, this is an emotional subject, and people could easily be getting there could be exaggeration about how bad the risks are. And in the mortality data as a whole, most people who've taken the vaccine have not died. It's not dramatic. But when we look at the younger age groups, we do see something. And what we see is that there has been an increase in deaths cumulatively from the spring of 2021. And every week we're seeing more deaths than we should be in the male 15 to 19 category. And what's particularly interesting about this category is that we're not seeing it in the females. The female deaths are higher than they were last year, but they're still within the range. You expect a certain amount of variation year to year. The male 15 to 19-year-old deaths are beyond that range. You can't just say this is a bad year, it's beyond that. And we've been calling this out for really many months now and requesting that there be an investigation. So when we've got an alarm signal like this, in a situation where the children themselves are not going to be benefiting, there should be a pause and an investigation, and that's what we're asking for. And just a quick word to talk about what's happened in the past with swine flu. So in 2009, WHO declared a swine flu pandemic, and systems went into place to ratchet up drug production of Tamiflu and vaccination. Our country bought 132 million doses of pandemics and started vaccinating people who were willing to be vaccinated, including children. And that was 2009. In 2010, Finland and Sweden mentioned they had a problem with narcolepsy in young people. In 2011, WHO were dismissing that as some funny Scandinavian problem. In 2013, Public Health England, for the first time, said we also had this problem, and it was about 1 in 55,000 of those vaccinated. In 2014, the drug was withdrawn. In 2020, Public Health England said, actually, in retrospect, it was more like 1 in 34,000. So you can see that these problems take time to get through the system, and we shouldn't be in this crazy rush for children. It's absolutely nonsense, and there needs to be a pause and an investigation.
Right, so this is over to Professor Dalgleish, Professor of Oncology at St George's Hospital in London, who's also a specialist in cancer vaccines particularly. You're going to talk a little bit about the immunology of all this, I hope.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. One of my titles is Principal of the Institute of Cancer Vaccines and Immunotherapy. So by very definition, I've done an awful lot of vaccines. I've been doing it for 30 years and was one of the very first to do cancer vaccines, and also to plod on and survive the fact that the vast majority of them didn't work, and to actually look very carefully at why they didn't work and why some of the ones did do work. And it was very interesting out of this. The first thing, which is very relevant for COVID, we found that if you had a low vitamin D, you were never going to respond to a vaccine or any other type of treatment, so you had to replace it. The second thing was the ones that were beneficial selectively boosted the T-cell response, and this is terribly important. In cancer, that was crucially important. Antibodies, no. So when you're going to design a vaccine for something, you want to know whether it is the T-cell response or the antibody response you need to do. And I then did a lot of work with HIV and developed with colleagues in Norway an HIV vaccine, which again, you had to boost the T-cell response, and you had to be very selective about what you put into the vaccine. You were never able to get much support for this because the NIH and Tony Fauci had the cure. It was going to be a big envelope-based vaccine, which failed time and time again over 30 years. So it was this in mind that when COVID came along, I was asked by my colleagues, what do you think we ought to do about doing the COVID vaccine? So I said the first thing is that we must make sure it's an airborne respiratory disease. The only thing that they really get control by is a T-cell response. And just let me remind you that SARS-1, which occurred in 2013, over 17 years later, the only people who recovered and have done well have strong T-cell responses. Forget about antibodies. The T-cell, it's the conductor of the immunological orchestra. It senses out if it's going to see another SARS-1, it presses the button, and the antibodies and everything are there. They don't have to be around. You have to have a T-cell response, and nobody is looking at this. So why do I put such a big pressure on this? And the fact is that children, they survive because they have a fantastic T-cell response. It is very strong, and it is very active and matures and locks in on memory very, very effectively. So I don't believe that children need a SARS-type vaccine because they've got good T-cell responses. We know that if you get the natural infection, and you're young and healthy, you have a fantastic T-cell response. So why should I be against the idea of giving boosters of a vaccine which clearly has been very beneficial in those over 55? And one of the things about those over 55, their immune system declines and their T-cell response declines just like that. So by the time you're 70, you've got a very poor immune response. And I pointed out before, it is interesting, the mirror opposite happens to the incidence of cancer. The mirror opposite happens to the incidence of COVID deaths, strongly implying that it is a very good T-cell response that is protecting you from these things. So I don't believe children need this. And I have several cases where I've seen them, actually people in age 20, when they've had a booster, they've actually gone downhill following the booster. They've got the symptoms of long COVID. And what the scientific explanation is that they didn't need it because these people have had COVID. We know the immune response to a child with COVID is as robust as you're going to get. They do not need vaccination. And if they do have vaccination, they have the problems, as we've heard, of the side effects. Now, in my own circle, my son had myocarditis requiring hospitalization after his first Pfizer vaccine. A friend of his had a stroke, and a niece of one of my closest friends died of a heart attack after a booster, a Pfizer booster, which they had to have for the job. They say if you know 2 people with something, it is common. That's 3. And then I have these people who are suffering from vaccines with a kind of a long COVID, which actually, in investigation, is a pericarditis. So I'd just like to reiterate that I really do not think there is any scientific rationale at all for vaccinating young people with healthy T-cell responses when the vast majority of the population of these people have seen the virus. I mean, it is in all the schools, all the young people, I mean, they have seen the virus. They do not need reminding with what is not nearly as good as the primary infection because it gives them an antibody inflammatory response, which not only do they not need, but is actually causing them the side effects and the problems that we're hearing. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
And I'll now hand over to Professor David Livermore from East Anglia University. And you've been involved at PHE in the past with antibiotic resistance, etc.
Absolutely. I ran the National Reference Laboratory for Antibiotic Resistance for Public Health England from 1997 through to 2011, since which I've worked for the University of East Anglia as Professor of Medical Microbiology. So 40 years in medical microbiology one way and another. I think I would start off by saying that in my view, the vaccines are a great achievement. They're new technology, they were developed very swiftly and successfully, and they broke the relationship between cases and deaths in the vulnerable. So if you're elderly, if you're vulnerable, it's well worth being vaccinated. However, it's entirely possible to use a good product or a useful product badly. And that, to my mind, is what's being done with children. the point's already been made is that contrary to some of the government's advertising, this is a virus that doesn't put everybody at risk. It's a virus for which a 75-year-old is several thousand times more likely to die than a 15-year-old. The risk of death or severe disease to healthy children is minimal. On the other hand, and perversely, and Ross showed the slides a moment ago, the risk of side effects with the vaccine, specifically myocarditis, specifically in boys, goes up as you go into younger age groups. Whether or not that's the explanation for the excess deaths in boys that Claire has outlined, I have no view. That certainly needs investigating and is a curious and disturbing observation. But let's come back to this question of vaccinating children, which has really been pressed over the past few months. We said children at very little risk of severe disease or death from the virus. But vaccination has been pressed. Now, if you go back to December last year, so before the Omicron wave, then the MRC Biostatistics Unit in Cambridge was estimating at that point 40% of 0 to 5-year-olds had already had the virus, 70% of 5 to 14-year-olds, and 50% of 15 to 25-year-olds. So lots and lots of young people, children or young adults, had already been infected. That was before the Omicron wave. Latterly, with Omicron having spiked and then come down again, the JCVI was estimating that 85% of 11 to 15-year-olds had already, 5 to 11-year-olds had already been infected. And presumably more than 17% now if we looked at the 11 to 15 slots. So very, very large proportions have been infected. So what possible benefit do they get from vaccination at this stage? We know Public Health England, or rather the UK Health Security Agency, as I should now call them, have published from their Siren study, at least with adults, that natural infection gives longer protection than any vaccine, which is logical because infection induces immunity at the respiratory surfaces, whereas vaccination does not, and it leads to an immune response to multiple components of the virus. So a large slab of children, a majority, are now being encouraged, or their parents encouraged, to be vaccinated or have them vaccinated, when they're already more immune than they'd be from vaccination, and they're being pressed to run a small risk of severe side effects for no benefits. What is left, of course, with the minority of children, 15 or 20 or 25% or whatever, who haven't yet had COVID? Do they benefit from vaccination? Well, I suggest minimally. Firstly, because we know that the vaccines are poorly matched to the prevalent Omicron variant. They only give a brief protection, so the child's going to get vaccinated, and a few months later, odds are that they're going to get infected anyway. Further, while I'm a supporter of vaccination, I do have two general concerns, to apply to adults as well as to children, over above any immediate side effect. This leads me to be very cautious about vaccinating where it's not needed. The first one is how evolution works. When you put a selection pressure with a product, with an antibiotic or with antiviral or with a vaccine, you put a selection on for virus or bacteria that escape that vaccine. It's easier to escape a vaccine than natural immunity because it's narrower-based, based only on the spike protein, not the whole virus. And frankly, at present, with Omicron, we're in a rather sweet place. We've got a mild variant of the virus, and we do not want to be pressing it to evolve away from that mild variant. And Patrick Vallance only the other night was saying we should fear further variants, and I don't disagree with him. Let's not encourage their evolution. Vaccinate people who need it, but not children who don't. And the other thing that concerns me is a concept that goes under the delicious name of original antigenic sin. Now, very briefly, your immune system gets imprinted by a pathogen the first time it sees it. And if you then get a further exposure, your immune system is apt to respond as if it was exactly what you saw the first time. Whereas actually it isn't. It's moved on a bit. And here we are using vaccines which are predicated, which are based on the spike protein of the original Wuhan variant. Already with Omicron, the viruses have gone a good way along. So I fear, I cannot prove, and I may be wrong, but I fear that where you vaccinate somebody unnecessarily, you're not actually doing them a great favour, because you're actually then priming them to respond to an old, extinct variant of the virus. So I strongly have the view that we should vaccinate, we should encourage vaccination, but we should encourage vaccination of the people who need it, who are the middle-aged, the elderly, the vulnerable. We shouldn't be vaccinating children. Most of them have had COVID already. Those who haven't already had COVID will frankly do better from getting the virus than getting the vaccine. And I do note that overnight, you may have missed it in all the horrors of Mr. Putin's invasion, but Iceland has dropped all requirements with regard to COVID. They have dropped all requirements for a vaccine passport to enter the country, and they have said that they want as many people to be infected as possible. I personally wouldn't go that far. That it acts as a robust natural vaccine. Now, I personally wouldn't go that far. I really don't want great granny in the care home, whether she's vaccinated or not, to be infected. But when it comes to children, that is the way out. It was recognised at the start, and sadly we deviated away from that. It cost us 2 years and much pain and much harm. I've talked too long. Hope I've conveyed this.
Thank you very much. So now I'll hand over to Liz, Dr. Elizabeth Evans, who's going to talk a bit about the ethics of all this.
Good afternoon. So it was a year ago, pretty much to the day, in February 2021, that the UK Medical Freedom Alliance wrote our first of several open letters to the JCVI and MHRA, raising serious ethical concerns over any future use, as it was then, of COVID vaccines in healthy children. And I want to focus on those ethical issues over the next few minutes. So when we're considering any medical intervention for an individual, it must be proportionate, necessary, and given under strict ethical principles. I think there's important wisdom in the Hippocratic Oath, which has been upheld by doctors around the world for over 2 millennia, which states, first, do no harm. As all medical interventions, as we've discussed, carry a risk of harm, we have a professional duty to always act with care and proportionality. In addition, a one-size-fits-all approach is a dangerous and unethical way to practice medicine, because at the heart of the practice of safe and ethical medicine is the doctor-patient relationship. And this is a place where the person's unique medical history, their individual risk profile, and also their personal philosophy and wishes should always be the prime concern of the doctor who is administering a treatment. So when it comes to children, it is very clear that the risk-benefit calculation does not support administering COVID vaccines to healthy children, who are at no risk statistically from COVID-19, and who have in any case mostly acquired robust and durable natural immunity by now. And we also must remember that these vaccines are not traditional vaccines, but are using a completely novel gene-based technology and are still in phase 3 trials. So without the long-term safety data on either the mRNA technology or on the specific COVID vaccines, we cannot know yet what, if any, long-term effects on health or fertility may become apparent over the next 5 to 10 years. We need to remember the vaccines have not been inside any adult for more than 21 months and for far less time in children. And we also now have, as the panel have outlined very clearly, emerging safety signals and acknowledged side effects, some serious, such as myocarditis, clotting and bleeding disorders and neurological conditions, and many of which appear to affect younger people disproportionately. And the possibility of detrimental health effects coming to light after a few years was actually raised by a spokesperson from AstraZeneca in August in 2020, when they were granted full immunity from liability for any harms from the vaccines. And their quotes were, "This is a unique situation where we as a company simply cannot take the risk if in 4 years the vaccine is showing side effects." So I'd like to ask if this risk is considered too high for the manufacturers economically. Surely we cannot allow our children to take the same level of risk with their long-term health, especially for a disease which is a so negligible risk to them. And as Claire pointed out earlier, medical history is littered with drugs and vaccines that were once considered safe and effective, but were subsequently withdrawn from the market months or even years after their use was started, as unforeseen harms were identified. And Claire talked about the Pandemrix vaccine that was rushed to market in the 2009 pandemic, withdrawn a few years later, but only after millions of doses had been given and over 1,000 children suffered the serious brain injury, narcolepsy, which had not been picked up in the trials. We really need to go back to the safe practice of medicine, which involves adapting and adjusting to new data and safety signals. And at this point, I think it's unprecedented that a pharmaceutical product that's still in the clinical trial phase is being recommended and administered to children on such a mass scale. And that this is being done without full transparency and disclosure of the known and, more importantly, unknown risks to children and young people, and with the aggressive marketing, actually seriously undermines the ability of parents and teenagers to give full, voluntary and informed consent. That is a legal and ethical requirement for all medical treatments under UK and international law and professional guidelines. So we've got to the point, I think it's vital that we go back to the ethical principles that underpin any civilised society, and that we put the safety of our children as our top priority. There is no scientific or ethical justification to support any further rollout of COVID vaccines to children. Therefore, we must urgently pause the programme.
Well, we've all been in a position of talking rather in theory about various potential hazards from the vaccines. But one of the things that's been concerning to me is the downplaying and, if not verging on censorship, of anybody who actually has suffered from harms. We are very grateful to have Max come today, because we didn't invite a child. We thought it was not appropriate at a setting like this. And we've got Max here, who's going to talk a little bit about his own experience. And he's here not just for himself, but for the hundreds of people that we already know and the thousands who we don't know about. So Max, do you want to just start by just giving us a little account of what actually happened to you after you had the vaccine?
No, sure, and thank you very much for asking me to be here today. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maxwell Harrison. I'm currently an aspiring barrister at BPP University. Alongside of that, I've been a ballroom dancer. So the stuff you see on Strictly for the last 14 and a half years. As a mild disclaimer, I have no credentials or background about medicine and whatnot, so I do apologise in advance for that. But no, so from my own personal experiences, in September I received my second Pfizer vaccination, and that was on the 1st of September, I'm trying to remember it myself now. And from then, after 8 days, with my good friend who sat with me today, I was taken to a hospital just around the corner from here after suffering a cardiac episode whereby I couldn't breathe. And from there, every day gradually, from that hospitalisation, I experienced severe palpitations from my heart. These usually came about when I had to do physical exertion, so it increased sort of heart rate, and this continued for an incredibly long time. And originally, I was at the NHS level, and they thought it was anxiety attacks. And any time I mentioned that, if it was to be from the vaccine, they in some way sneered at me, laughed at me, and said it was a conspiracy theory. On the 17th of December 2021, I was diagnosed with perimyocarditis from one of the leading cardiologists in the country in Harley Street, because I had to go onto that stream to only be able to access any sort of avenue of having proper tests, MRIs, and any formal results. From then, I have now been on a course of medication, and I'm slowly getting better. However, it is very clear in my conversations, which I'm having with this cardiologist and with leading professionals in the medical sector, that this is more than just a rare instance. It isn't just me, this is hundreds of people. And like you all today, I'm shocked to hear the level of extent to how much this is occurring around the rest of Europe, USA, and in Asia. It is quite frightening that when we originally got the vaccines, we were told of no prior side effects. And for young people, especially us, who may do a bit more exercise than the older generation, again, we were told, we were going to be told that nothing would come about from it. And what we've seen, in my view anyway, for experiences, I've heard of rugby players not being able to compete in their sports anymore, runners, one in Gillingham who had a hole in their heart from trying to over-exercise. And what I would say, that more importantly than anything else, is that I was originally told that this, if anything, with inflammation of the heart when I started the private in Kent, leading to London, I was told that actually this is a side effect which will predominantly be in my life now for the next 12 to 18 months. Since November I haven't danced, but in October, because I had no prior warning about this, I represented Great Britain at the World Championships. Although it wasn't the result I wanted, I came sixth. It wasn't the result I wanted, to be honest. I had 2 attacks at the competition, and I had to be dealt with paramedics. And again, this was at a time when I had no idea of how drastic it was. And I'll tell you that the cardiologist, when I told them that I had these 2 attacks, he said I could have potentially lost my life. There are multiple times when I would go to sleep and I would be worried that I wouldn't wake up. And this is something which although it's being addressed now, I do worry about why this isn't being reported in the mainstream media. I do feel that as an outsider and as a legal student, I am greatly concerned why this isn't a national conversation. In December, I appeared on GB News and was given the opportunity to speak about this, which I was incredibly thankful for. But again, this needs to be out there, because and as the medical professionals are saying today, this is an ever-increased chance for young people, for young children. There needs to be an urgent investigation into this now. It will surprise you, yes, I am pro-vaccine. I'm libertarian, I believe it's people's choice. But with choice, you have to be made aware of the risks. And if there are risks to the vaccine, then young people should be told about this, parents should be told about this, families should be told about this, and the government should be open and upfront about this. So that's my personal experience, and I thank you so very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max, for saying that. And from what I'm talking to you earlier, when you went for your vaccination, nobody presumably discussed with you the likely risk to you from COVID as a healthy 21-year-old?
No, I mean, with young people genuinely, we were told at the very beginning, back in summer 2021, that this issue, apologise, was mainly for elderly people.
Yeah.
For young people, we would get through mild cough symptoms, that'd be that. And even when I got the vaccine, and the white little sheets that we were given, there was no reasonable side effects that was written on there, and especially, now I believe now it says that you can't exercise after 72 hours. Again, we weren't raised by that at all.
And it's interesting that Hong Kong, when I mentioned data from Hong Kong in that slide on myocarditis, when I spoke to the guy there about it, and he emailed me their information leaflet that goes out with the vaccine, which told them that they were not to do any strenuous exercise for a week after vaccination. Well, if you told parents here that, it would kind of make them sit up and think, why? Is this really such a, oh, you know, you get mild side effects like a sore arm, it'll be fine. So, yeah, well, thank you very much indeed for that. And I think I've just got a couple more slides. I'll come back to the JCVI. Now, this was the JCVI's evaluation in 2021, September. So the benefits were really quite unclear. 3 things they commented in the minutes of the meeting. You could see that children were very mildly affected by COVID-19, as we've already discussed. The risk, the chance of death for an under 18, healthy under 18 is about, well, it's less than 1 in a million. Schools were not thought to be a major source of transmission, and also it was noted that children were less likely to infect adults than the reverse. So all this about protecting your grandma and so on, is this really right? And on the downside, this is going back, we're talking about September last year, there were quite a lot of uncertainties. Myocarditis they already knew was higher in adolescents. They knew no long-term safety data on the recovery for the children who had already had myocarditis in the States. They knew that the vaccine Pfizer trial was very small. There were only 1,131 children in the 12 to 15s arm who received the vaccine. And they were followed for 2 months. And on that basis, MHRA was saying safe and effective. So they knew all that. And they knew also that they thought the risk balance was too close to call for use in healthy children. But the chief medical officers then looked at it and did a modelling on school days lost and said, oh, well, if we roll out the vaccine, it'll reduce school days lost. Now, they admitted that the modelling took no account of past immunity, which David's already referred to, and it also took no account of any potential vaccine side effects. And the calculation was that it would save 15 minutes of lost schooling on average per child. Well, you'd wait 15 minutes after your Pfizer vaccine in the morning. And you'd probably be out of class for about an hour, all told, I imagine. And it was meant to improve mental health, which was hard to work out, and particularly if you landed up with a child in your school being helicoptered off the sports field the next week. I don't think that would do a lot for your mental health. But anyway, that was their conclusion. They thought that it was really in the balance and it probably shouldn't go ahead, and it's very obvious from the minutes of those meetings that they had major concerns, the members of the committee, and yet they passed it to the CMOs who said, well, let's go ahead, but let's just give 1 dose, because we know that the main risks, as Max himself discovered, were after the 2nd dose. But in fact, of course, it then got changed about 2 months later with no further information to say, let's do 2 doses. So then where are we now? Well, now we're in the situation that it's even further in the wrong direction. We now know that Omicron, as we've said, is even milder, and that 85% of children have had it, and natural immunity is stronger than vaccination, all the things that we would have anticipated. We've got Norway and Sweden saying 5 to 11s don't need it. We've got Norway and Holland saying that children who've already had COVID don't need it. The first countries to actually acknowledge that natural immunity is robust. And on the other side, the growing evidence of risks. We know that this vaccine won't be as effective as against Omicron anyway. So at the end of it, and about the various different aspects of myocarditis that we've talked about, 8 to 10% of US primary school children have missed at least 1 day's schooling following vaccination. So if we're using it to try and increase schooling attendance, it's not going to be very good at that. And everything we've really discussed, in particular, apart from the non-COVID deaths that Claire discussed, I think is this question about whether vaccination will alter your immune response. And I, as a paediatrician, who obviously throughout my career was encouraging parents to get their children fully vaccinated for everything, this is completely different. The mRNA technology, as Liz mentioned, is very new, and if it alters immunity in any way, that's particularly important. The younger the child, they're at the beginning of their immune career, working out, their immune system is working out what's what and how to do it, and if they get imprinted onto some vaccine that is out of date already, how on earth is that going to help their long-term health? And yet, despite all that, the JCVI conclusion was, oh, let's carry on with the 2nd dose for 12 to 15s, and at the time when we are writing saying, please pause the 12 to 15s because we think there's a significant safety signal, the that needs investigating, they're saying, oh no, why don't we give it to healthy 5 to 11s as well? So the next slide I'm going to show you is quite distressing. I was told I had to put a warning up, but this is a slide from an education pack that was sent into secondary schools in London. That slide was followed by a slide saying, when can I have my COVID vaccine? Now, if we are suggesting to children that COVID-19 for them is anything like devastating illnesses of smallpox and polio, then no wonder we're not getting informed consent. This, to my mind, is absolutely unethical. The fact that somebody told me I had to put a warning up before I showed you this slide, they were upset I put it in the slide stack last night when I was sharing it. And yet that's in secondary schools in London. And this is wrong. Any questions
Ross,
at all?
before we start, could you bring us up to speed with the JCVI's reaction to the CCVAG's letters, please?
Yes, I'm not sure I mentioned that apart from our letter, which we sent 2 weeks ago, by complete coincidence, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Pandemic Recovery had written a very similar letter, also asking for a pause. And that was signed by a dozen MPs and 3 members of the House of Lords, and also some of the senior clinicians. I think, I'm not sure, no, Roland Salmon certainly signed both letters, a number of people have. And they had a reply to their first letter, just as we've had replies to very early letters, but then the reply is always very bland and it doesn't actually answer the questions you've asked. So they then sent another letter a couple of weeks ago, and they've had no reply. We've had no reply this time round from the JCVI at all. The only replies in the past from the JCVI have usually been to say it's the responsibility of the MHRA. And the MHRA, when they approved for temporary authorisation the 12 to 15s, they only looked at the Pfizer trial data. They did not look at real world data. They said they hadn't. So they are looking at the data from a drug company that is going to be making all the profits on this. So that is worrying. We went today to deliver the letter to the JCVI, having had no reply, and now we've got our 700 signatures instead of the 90 we started with. So it was a nice fat packet, and we went along with, I have to say, a camera crew, which perhaps was a mistake as it turned out, because there's Liz and me and a couple of others who'd signed the letter about to hand it in. I phoned yesterday, and they knew we were going to bring this letter to deliver it in person to the office in Waterloo Road. And we just took some photos outside, and then I stepped forward to the door, and suddenly the lights had gone off and the door was locked. So I was a bit puzzled, and there were 3 guys inside there. I could see them. I was hammering and waving and thought they'd come across to open the door, and we couldn't find a buzzer. And so in the end, I phoned the same number I'd phoned yesterday, and they said they would couldn't understand why we couldn't get in. But she said, I'll hang on, I'm not in the same building, so she would inquire. Then eventually somebody else said, oh no, it should be fine. And then I had to phone again, and then we phoned again, and then they said, oh no, there's a bit of a problem at the moment because there's a security alert because of a protest. And I said, well, if we're the protest, we're just 4 women with a letter. I think we could have done better than that if it was a real protest. We would have got several thousand, if not 1 million. But anyway, that was our protest. So in the end, they said they were sending the deputy manager down, and at that point I'd left in a taxi to come here because I thought, I didn't want to be late for the press conference. But Anna, fortunately, was still there, and this guy suddenly emerged and she handed him the letter. So they have got the letter. So, but it is quite worrying to think that the level of anxiety is such that you can't even hand a letter into a public building.
Are there any questions?
Hello, thank you so much. I just am so impressed by the conference, by all your presentations. I can't tell you how important I think it is, and I hope I'll aim to get transcripts of everything I've got and anything else I've missed and publish each and every one. It needs documenting at every possible level, spoken, streaming, and then endless PR type things. Very, very impressive and very full. I've got 2 questions. I'll try and be quick. One man never seems to get any attention or focus in our attempts to expose what's really going on or why they're doing what they are. And that is, I think he's the current chairman of the JCVI, VI, a Dr. Wen, a Dr. Lim Wen, somebody? Does anybody know him? Do any of us? He never seems to get written to. He always seems to keep his head under the parapet. He's been involved in so many things, and I think for me, it would be nice if we began to put some of these people's faces in the frame. These are the people making these decisions. So that was one question. The second was, with the Pfizer trials on the children that you've reviewed, was there any trial for what the effect of the second vaccine on children would be? Has the second number 2 vaccine ever been trialled? Not that I think any child should be in that trial, but...
Yes. I could probably answer those. Thank you very much. Kathy Gindle from the Conservative Woman. The first answer to your first question is he was the main name on the envelope we handed in today. So he's Professor Wei Shen Lim, and he's based in Leicester, but he was the first name on the letter. And he did reply earlier, about 6 months ago, to the first letter I sent, but I haven't had any replies more recently. I don't know him personally. But the second question is, that study was including both doses. It was based on the 2 doses. Certainly the boosters for children, I think the ongoing data for that is very limited. And in terms of the 5 to 11s trial, I think it's important to note that Pfizer, in their own submission to the FDA for temporary authorization, stated that the trial was too small to pick up rare effects such as myocarditis, and they will be rolling out post-marketing a cohort study which would report back in 5 years, in 2027. So what they're really saying is, give it to millions of children around the world, and in 5 years' time we might find there's a serious side effect. And that is, as Max saying, this is not about informed consent.
My name's Alan Black. I'm a retired pharmaceutical physician. None of the COVID-19 vaccines, including the Pfizer one, currently has a full marketing authorization, a full license in common parlance. What they have is a thing called a conditional marketing authorization, a conditional license if you like. In their guidance regarding CMAs, which is short for conditional marketing authorization, the MHRA say in their own words that they may grant a CMA where comprehensive clinical data is not yet complete, but it is judged that such data will become available soon. Now, I understand that the first data submitted by Pfizer to the MHRA for review and assessment was submitted in October 2020. I believe that's true. Pfizer's CMA was issued in January 21, and it was renewed by the MHRA in December 21, so we still have a conditional marketing authorization. Our regulatory authorities have still not yet judged that the data sets for safety and efficacy are sufficiently complete or comprehensive for them to be confident enough to issue the Pfizer vaccine, or any of the COVID vaccines for that matter, with a full marketing authorization, a full license. Some of these data are not due to be submitted to the MHRA until 2024. How do the panel think this conditional or provisional regulatory status of the vaccines should influence any decision to extend the use of COVID-19 vaccination to healthy children?
Well, I've been following what's been going on in the States, where what's been given to the regulators appears to be, or what's been disclosed to the public in the trial data seems to be a very, very small amount of the data that was actually available. So there are apparently hundreds of thousands of pages of the clinical trial data that the FDA, the Federal Drug Agency in America, who are like our MHRA, they have, and they applied to the courts a few weeks ago, saying they didn't want to release it for 75 years. I mean, it was a bit of a story, but it ended up that they wanted the date for release of all of that data to be in 75 years' time. There's currently legal challenges going on. I believe it might now have been reduced to 8 months. But what's fascinating is the idea that there can be no public scrutiny of this, data which only took a few months to actually accumulate. It's probably 6 months worth of trial data, And they wanted to just release 500 pages a month, I think it was, for the next 75 years. So it raises the question, what is in that data that they're so worried about? You know, why can't we just see it all? You know, it wouldn't take long for a team of doctors, you know, if they were given that data, it'd give them 3 or 4 months, they could go through it. And how can we possibly give informed, or obtain informed consent and get informed consent from people to have this vaccine if they don't have that data at their fingertips and we can't see what the issues are, if there are any. I mean, we have no idea. So, and I suspect it's a similar situation here with the MHRA, but I don't know whether that's been quite so publicly available.
Thank you. I would just like to add to that. I know people who've seen that data and they've gone through it and they've analysed. What that data shows, if you have an SAE, a serious adverse event recorded to the Pfizer vaccine, you have a 3% chance of death, which compares with an 0.085% chance of death from all populations with the vaccine. That is what they're trying to hide. And it is worth reminding, not just hiding away from things that, you know, an awful lot of stuff that I've been wanting to talk about, you can't talk about this, that and the other, but it is out there, it's in the public domain. Pfizer, as an organisation, have had 31 criminal prosecutions executed by the FDA for fraud, misrepresentation, withholding data, bribing clinicians and bribing regulators. This is the nature of the beast you're dealing with. So why should we be enthralled to an organisation like this who tells us what the conditions are for which populations we can use with their vaccine, that we do not have access to the raw data? And the people who have access to that raw data said it's bloody obvious why they don't want us to see it. Now, that should be fairly obvious to anybody. If somebody wants to, has got bad data, they try and hide it. I mean, I was involved with the origins of the virus. It was obvious to me that this virus had inserts. It had been engineered and escaped from the laboratory. We weren't allowed to mention that. It was, oh, this, that and the other. But China go out of their way to help us by saying, you're not allowed to see anything. They shut the laboratories, they sterilised everything, and said, oh no, it was a natural jump. It occurred 1,000 miles away from the fact of human. I mean, so when people lock down the evidence, you've got to be quite reasonably suspicious. What are they trying to hide? We now know in the origins they were trying to hide it, and Matt Ridley has come out and said obviously it must have come from the laboratory and escaped, but we'll never know. I disagree on that because I've got this, analysed the sequence data. It's 1 billion to 1 that possibly arranged naturally. And we're dealing the same now here with the same paradigm that they're trying to hide the data that we need to know to protect those who are not going to benefit from the vaccine. And I think it's a scandal. It's an absolutely enormous scandal when they're wanting to immunise billions of children throughout the world with something which they know has a significant side effect profile. You've heard today the side effect profile is, and in my personal experience, the younger you are, the worse it is. And we've heard that we've been able to focus on myocarditis in young men. So I think this is extremely important to bear this in mind. And I thank you very much for raising this issue, that it's not a licensed product at all. It's very conditional. Thank you.
I think just to follow on from that, yes, if one mentions that it's still in the research phase, that kind of gets labelled as conspiracy theory. But I think it's very important we do remember that all these drugs are still in the trial phase. And also interestingly, the BMJ had a leader very recently in which they were saying, normally, for any publication, if you want to get an article into the BMJ on your research, you have to let them have the raw data. So why does that not apply to these vaccines? So they've been speaking out very loudly, saying exactly what you've just said.
Hello, I'm Sonia Elijah, and I just wanted to thank you all for this very important panel today. I wanted to let you know that I did write back in December. I analysed one of the safety documents that was released by the FDA, one of Pfizer's own safety reports. It was the cumulative analysis of all these sort of vaccine adverse events. And I thoroughly read through that report and I analysed it, and it's very alarming what was reported. over 1,200 deaths. This was within a 3-month period. Women were 3 times more likely to be affected by these adverse events. There were recorded spontaneous abortions when the vaccines were given to pregnant women, and just very large proportions of serious adverse events. And this was published for Transite News, a US publication. I was interviewed by an Australian company called Calkine Media, and they have their own YouTube channel. They interviewed me based on my report, my analysis. Over 2 days, the video went viral, over 1 million views, and on the 3rd day, YouTube censored the video, banned it. So this is just my own personal experience, and I wanted to share that with you today.
Thank you.
So the question is, I'm not medical, so I'm Tony Buxton, I work on GB News, I work on Talk Radio, and I was cook before this happened, but because of this happening, I thought I had to speak up and start pointing out something very sinister and something very wrong going on. So this question I know you can't answer, but I want to put it out there, is why are the governments of the world allowing Big Pharma to inject our children with a chemical that could well do them harm? I don't expect an answer, but that is the question that needs to be asked across the world.
I mean, certainly if I, as a paediatrician, or Andrew Pollard comes back 3 years ago and said, I've got a brand new vaccine, I've got no safety data on it, but it's going to be fantastic for children to treat them for the common cold, we would have been reported to the GMC or the Three Wise Men system in your hospital. I mean, that would have been totally, out with any normal behaviour for a medic. So I can't answer your question. I think it's the huge question that is on everybody's minds.
I can, and I think I can try anyway. Because I think the fault lies elsewhere. I don't think the fault lies with the pharmaceutical companies. Yes, there are concerns about the data and the access to it. I completely agree with that. I think those data should be brought into the public domain. But I don't think it's the pharmaceutical companies which have been pressing and seeking to market their product. It's been the governments which have been scrabbling about to get those products and to deploy them as widely as possible. This is governments who want to use the vaccine rather than companies that desperately wish to sell it. And the issue there, I think, is that it ran away. That if you go back to what Kate Bingham was recommending in the end of 2020, beginning of 21, was that just those 5 priority groups, essentially anybody over 50, healthcare workers, plus people with particular risk factors, were going to be vaccinated. Quote, this is not going to be a vaccine for everyone. Then government, chief medical officers, maybe JCVI, I thought that at that time they were less biased, it was more than chief medical officers who wanted to vaccinate as widely as possible. They seemed to convince themselves that these products had 70 to 95% efficacy in preventing infection. If we can vaccinate everybody, we can squeeze these viruses out of circulation. They were dead wrong, because the virus evolved to become more transmissible, and the immunity behaved exactly like natural immunity to the 4 long-established coronaviruses, meaning it went down. But it went down more quickly after vaccination than after natural infection. So they've swapped from this reasonable idea of vaccinating risk groups to an idea of vaccinate everybody, squeeze the virus out of circulation as we did with polio, and the vaccine's not capable of doing that, and they are not capable of admitting what they tried to do and that it has failed. And I think that's what's so critical about Iceland, because they have essentially admitted that.
Because they don't care about the damages that they'll do to our children just so they won't be seen to make the right point. I agree with you. If you're vulnerable, if you need it, fine, take this vaccine. But the reality is that governments across the world look at this, children, babies, to be vaccinated for something that can only do them harm. My mind cannot conceive that this is continuing, that we're sitting actually in this room having this conversation. It's gone beyond sinister now, and the mainstream media will not allow us to discuss it. We get called conspiracy theorists and the terrible things that I've been called, just wanting to ask a few questions. And I'm worried about the state of governments around the world continuing to push this.
Well, absolutely, I'm worried by governments around the world on many counts, and one of them has nothing to include Bill. But what I would say to you is, my opinion, which may be right or wrong, I think there is more cock-up and mad optimism from early in the history of vaccines than a conspiracy there. And they just become more desperate and they double down. Oh well, if we vaccinate all adults, that's not achieved. It's not got the R number there. Or we vaccinate children as well and keep squeezing down.
We've got
a couple of more questions.
I just want to say that I think you are an honourable and kind man, but the reality is that some people are making phenomenal amounts of money from this vaccine, and that's the reason that it's being shut down.
Quickly comment on this, and then we'll go to
I just wanted to say, I think this is why it's really important that we go back to talking about ethics, because actually what we've allowed as a society is that for governments and politicians to be practicing medicine, that's not safe for anybody, it's dangerous. We've got to go back to the doctor-patient relationship. We're hearing of people all the time who've had a bad reaction to the first vaccine. They are not allowed an exemption for their second vaccine. You know, doctors are saying, yeah, no, I don't think you should have another one, but I'm not going to write you an exemption. What is going on? You know, we cannot have a doctor not able to make us, you know, a professional medical decision on behalf of his patient sitting in front of him or her. And I think that's where we've gone wrong. And as patients, as the public, we have to demand that we go back to that practice of, individualised doctor-patient medicine, and not governments practicing medicine through policy. It doesn't work. It's dangerous. The greater good is a very dangerous ideology, and we cannot allow our society to go down that route.
So Max is just going to comment.
I just want to add my own personal thanks. Today is, of course, Freedom Day. And I follow you on Twitter and Watchot, and follow Adam Brooks, and you work with together, don't you?
Yeah.
So I'd actually just like to say thank you actually for the work that you've been doing, Adam's been doing, the whole team, because I don't believe that today we'd be actually be having our civil liberties back today. So actually I just want to say thank you. Thank you for coming today.
I too respect your views, sir, but I'm afraid I disagree as well. There is a word that's the elephant in the room, and the word is corruption.
Yeah.
There is I'm a media person, or was. There is absolutely no way that the censorship, the controlled censorship of the media and social media, and any one word that mentions anti-vaccine or ivermectin is immediately withdrawn from the world stage. This is not accidental. There may well have been cock-ups on the way, but going right back to your point about Wuhan, the investigation was carried out by Peter Daszak, who himself was working with Wuhan, with American money, developing the vaccine. Daszak then advised the White House. He then organised a letter to the medical journals, rubbishing any theory that it could have been from the lab, but had to be natural. The man is conflicted, right, left, and centre. And I'm ashamed, and I would apologise to everybody about the way the media have behaved over all this. I was the boss of Sky News at one time and ITV, and I sat at home angry and frustrated at the way they're behaving. But it can't be accidental. We have tried. I'm now working with a group of journalists, and we're trying really hard to break the mould, and we're writing online and elsewhere. We cannot get these stories into the mainstream media. Now, there are many reasons, but it is being controlled, and it's naive to think it's not. I don't know, there are two, your profession, the medical profession, and my trade. I don't call that a profession, because you don't need any qualifications. But both of us should be ashamed of the general mix. Where everybody else, Max is one of the people I've spoken to in the past, but I'm now talking to victims every day, and it's horrific. And the doctors know that they're seeing more examples in the hospitals, and they're not speaking up. And the media are not speaking up. So you have to ask why. It isn't all about a cock-up, believe me. It can't be. It just cannot be. Is there any mainstream media here at all? You know, I mean, I've sent an invitation.
GB News is mainstream.
So we've only got time for a couple more questions. Do you have a question coming on?
I've sent my former colleagues at Sky, people I work with, I've sent them a personal invitation today on the back of lots of things, and they still haven't come. You know, you are eminent scientists and doctors with opinions, and what does your boss say? Misinformation.
We're going to have to go to another question. I'm sorry, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions, and both represent young children, if you like. The first one, there's been lots of mention from the panel about healthy children. I recently saw a children's charitable organisation that was begging for the vaccine for the vulnerable children with difficulties. And I feel that some clarity on the panel's opinions for those children, for whom it's not too late, would be useful. And I'd just like to share one very brief testimony of somebody I know, a father, divorced from the mother, conflicting views on the vaccine for their autistic son, who was in a care home. She wanted it for him, he didn't. A GP who didn't know the child was brought in with this panel discussion on whether the child should have it or not. Effectively, to cut to the chase, the GP prescribed a drug that would sedate him. It didn't work for him and he pulled away and only had a half of the second jab, and then they still wanted him to have a third and just up the dose of the tranquilizing drug. So I would be interested in the panel's views on the vaccine for vulnerable children, given that there are some parents and organisations representing those children who are clamouring for it, and GPs who clearly think it's their job to give it, regardless of what the child or the vulnerable adult wants. And the second thing is that I represent pregnant women with my organisation, Syntonic Birth. Throughout this, I've been deeply concerned about the advice coming down from the organisations that are there to protect women, advising for them to get it. And I understand that there's just been another announcement to say, from Chris Whitty, to say, if you're pregnant, there's lots of data to show you get it. So could the panel please address those two cohorts of people? Thank you. Oh, sorry, I would just say that my sister-in-law she got it when she was pregnant as an early cohort, second jab in the summer, and whilst pregnant, and suffered neurological difficulties, lost the use of her legs, and was diagnosed with functional neuropathy or something. Basically means I don't know what it is. And again, it's not been linked, so I don't know if she would have had the third by now. Another testimony. Thank you.
I would pick up on the first question. It's interesting because when back in the summer they said that the JCVI said they weren't recommending it for healthy children, but they would recommend it to vulnerable. I put something on Twitter about, oh, well, that's good news that they're being, cautious. And I had a response from a parent saying, so are you saying my disabled child isn't worth worrying about? Which was chilling, because actually, of course, they need protection from harm just as much, if not more so, than healthy children. We had contact a family get in touch earlier on when I was campaigning, saying they thought that our campaign against children's vaccines was preventing their children getting the vaccines they wanted. And the worry is that if you look at the sort of children who have really come to grief with COVID, they have major comorbidities. And yet, at the end, the list that's gone out is simply, if you're on the Learning Disabilities Register. Now, there was a study from March 2020 to March 2021, because not a lot of children die, and there is an existing deaths registry where every child who dies, there's a notes review and so on to look for avoidable factors. And out of 61 children who died with a PCR test positive within the previous month, only 25 of those were deemed to have died with COVID as related to their death, because most of them, they just happened to have a positive test. They might have died in a car crash or whatever. But of those 25, 6 were healthy children and 19 had comorbidities. And they were major. There wasn't a child with Down syndrome who died, except there was a child with Down syndrome who got major congenital heart complications as well. And there wasn't a child with learning difficulties who died. They were children with cerebral palsy and, as you know, curvature of the spine, multiple admissions to intensive care for previous infections. So that was the sort of child. And I think if you're the parent of a child in that situation, it's a very reasonable choice. But of course the choice was already there, because a clinician, that comes back to Liz's point about the personal relationship, a clinician could always have prescribed, and there was a system for a paediatrician with a parent, one-to-one, discussing the risk to that child of getting COVID. Shall we give this unlicensed drug or not? And that you could do. So it didn't need to be approved in order to allow genuinely vulnerable children, in conjunction with their paediatrician, to have the immunisation. So I think the blanket thing of just saying, oh, well, let's give it to any child on the register is really not good. I personally am not an obstetrician, and thank goodness I don't have to answer the second question.
Does anyone want to come in before we go to our final question or two?
My feeling is we should leave the middle question, because to be honest, it's a completely different, it's not something any of us have been majorly looking at.
Okay, we'll go to this lady and then maybe one final question to this lady.
Hi, my name is Irene. I'm a medical doctor, junior doctor in the NHS. And at the moment I'm ashamed of my profession, and I just want to ask a few questions. First of all is why, as a junior doctor, I have never been taught how to report side effects of the vaccine and what to look for. And this is in the hospital that I work, no one has been taught that. And secondly, is it legal to advertise an experimental prescription medical treatment? And how much money the government has spent in view of the failing NHS to advertise vaccine over the last 2 years? Thank you very much.
I'd like to address the first aspect of that, and that is that doctors are basically being orchestrated, brainwashed into saying, you've got to give this vaccine, there's no side effects. Now, this brainwashing has gone so high that someone right at the top of the task force said, well, there are a few problems, but at least across the board, there are no serious side effects whatsoever, aren't we lucky? And I basically had to say, sorry, I'm a cold-faced doctor, I see patients, this, that and the other, this is just not true. And I really got 2 things I wanted to really stress here. One is, we talk about the VERS from Pfizer and how bad it is that they want to keep it in, but there is something even more hidden here. And that's what you brought up about the doctors. They are not reporting the side effects that so clearly exist. Yeah. I know some serious side effects, and the doctors haven't reported it. And the person says, please report this, it is associated. And they say, no, it's not, it's just a coincidence. It's not my job to report it. Go back to the person who gave you the vaccine and get them to report it. Of course, they're not here because the vaccine clinic's closed down. And so these side effects are not getting reported. So what you're seeing is the tip of the iceberg. And that's, I agree with you. I'm also disgusted with my profession, the way they have taken everything lying down. It's appalling. The second point I'd like to make, which comes from this battery, this sort of onslaught of giving people unnecessary vaccinations. I actually raised this point several times, and I've had nobody sensibly give me a reply. Once I raised it on GB News in an interview too, is why would you give somebody a vaccine who tells you that they've had the infection and they've recovered very well, but why wouldn't you test to see if they need the vaccine? Oh no, they said it's too much trouble to test, it's much easier to give the vaccine. And on one occasion I pointed out, well, I've just come back from Croatia and I had more bloody tests than I had hot dinners, you know, so it's not difficult to do tests for it. And that is something I fought passionately for. It is very easy to do a T-cell test. Have they got the memory that they do not need? No, they will not do it. It is very simple. If they did that for everybody, they would save an enormous number of vaccines, and the vaccines cost far more than the test. So what bit do they not, what bit do they not want to get? So I think it's really bad giving vaccines to people who've already been exposed to the vaccine, to the virus itself, and had a very good immune response, when for young people, all you're going to do is perturbate a fine T-cell controlling response, knock it off course, make it inflammatory, so it can't see in the other bugs coming in. Because that's basically one of the things that happened to you that gave you the myocarditis. So thank you very much for bringing that up. I can't answer all the other questions.
With regard, very briefly, to the government spending, that is absolutely outrageous. 2-page spread in the Daily Telegraph, tail end of last week, I think it was, encouraging people to be vaccinated, not because it was going to protect them individually, but the headline cases and all sort of case histories were, I am getting vaccinated to protect other people. Despite great clarity now that the vaccine, whatever its merits for preventing severe disease in the vulnerable, does not prevent infection and transmission. Absolutely disgraceful advertising, all being paid for out of our taxes.
Okay.
Yeah, just like, because you said about the pregnancy bill, I'm a qualified midwife. I'm fortunately not working in the NHS at the moment, which I'm rather pleased about. But I'd quite like to go back, and all this vaccine mandate nonsense, quite frankly, I was fighting that cause for many of my colleagues. But I was, in the beginning, I was beginning to think, am I the only one who thinks it's totally insane to be giving these experimental injections to pregnant women? We know how difficult it is to give, you can't get a drug licensed for pregnancy. You really have to weigh up the risk benefit analysis, and there was like no informed consent. We don't know what this is doing to pregnant women. It does come into children because, this spike protein is replicating, it goes across the placenta, it's in the fetus, this is lifelong problems. I wrote to the MHRA in February 21, and I said, I wrote to the NMC and the RCM, and I was like, seriously, what are you doing? They didn't reply for about 2 months. Eventually I got a nice little beige, bland reply which didn't answer any of my questions, so I was smiling right as I was saying that. And actually that letter's being used in the legal case. It's gone as documentation against them because they cannot say they did not know that people, yes, I'm a midwife, but also a mother, and concerns about women, they cannot say they didn't know. And I have a friend whose mother was given the thalidomide drug, and so it's just too close to the bone. I just think it's totally insane. And you're nodding, you're agreeing. Thank you.
Does anyone want to comment?
I feel so lonely, and I've been really speaking out for many midwives who have said
Yeah, and just to add to that, the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, we've written lots of letters on pregnant women and the vaccine. So we've written ones to the NMC, to the Royal College of Obs and Gynae, to the MHRA. So there's lots of reference letters out there which may help you to learn about that. And also, what's interesting is, of course, most women who are pregnant are young and healthy. So although it raises your risk slightly to be pregnant compared to your peer who is not pregnant, you're still very low risk. And I think what's really worrying is a lot of people are walking around terrified that they're high risk from COVID, whereas in fact they've gone from an extremely low risk to a slightly less extremely low risk. And I think that is interfering with informed consent again, and also making people behave in a very, very anxious way during pregnancy, which is when you don't want to be with high levels of cortisol and stressed and anxious. So yeah.
My name is Radek. I'm here in first place as a concerned father. I'm thinking about the future of young generation. But my question is from two parts. So first one would be, what can we do to prevent such situation that happened? How can we prevent hijack of the science, real science, merit science by politics? Like we had an argument by likes of Dr. Fauci, who was saying attack on me or questioning me is attack on the science. And the second thing is how can we re-educate people, because we've came to such a division in society, and the basis of the society is trust.
I think the crux of the problem is that politics and science are opposites. Politics, you need to have certainty, whatever happens, you need to be saying things confidently, and science is all about uncertainty. Science is all about being wrong. We're learning all the time in science from mistakes, not from thinking that we're right. You can't do science if you think you're right all the time. So they are fundamentally clashed from the beginning, and we're in a society now where debate is dead. People don't want to listen to things that don't conform to their prior beliefs, and that is a very, very difficult hole to get out of in the terms of social media bubbles and that kind of thing. And we also have a problem with politicians who, very few of whom have a scientific background. And I think that is a problem that we do need to address longer term, but clearly that's going to take a long time to fix. But you know, we can't have them just without that background making decisions in the way that they are making them. And there's my hope is that in time all of the truth is going to come out, and it's going to be revolutionary, because when people see how they've been lied to and see all the deceit, then that's the point at which people are not going to let it happen again. But we have to get to that point. It's only when we can get to that point that we can actually start thinking about building up new systems and having things less centralised.
Can I just make a very quick comment? As a clinician who trained and went in to do really basic science and really focused on basic science for a long time, I never thought I'd live to see the day when COVID ushered in the death of science, because that is what I have witnessed. My colleagues do not want to discuss it. Science is meant to be looking at the evidence and coming to a conclusion. If it's not obvious, you set up an experiment and look at the result. They just don't want to know. And Matt Ridley told me that basically when he was doing the research for his book, he went to the Royal Society. It's meant to be the pinnacle of our scientific institutions, and everybody from the top down refused to discuss the origin of the virus because they said it was so obvious it would come from a zoonosis, it would come from a bat to a human. Well, I had held the institution in a great esteem. After that, I thought, you know, what is the point? What is the point when scientists will no longer be science?
Yeah.
Max?
Picking up on your point, there is no debate in this country anymore about anything.
Yeah.
You are up against the mainstream media, you're up against the establishment. And although having studied law for 4 years, there's one thing that clicks into my mind is Article 10 of the Human Rights Act 1998. That's freedom of expression. And we really, really don't have that in this country, in this plethora of these issues. And from the sounds of it, in the medical sphere, you don't have that anymore. And as a victim of the vaccine injury, I can wholeheartedly support everything that everyone is doing here. And that if there has to be an initiative going forward to make sure that the truth comes out, that rightness comes out, that justice prevails, that is the only way of going forward, and that's the only way of having this whole mess ever ending. Thank you.
I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap it up. But the world has changed, because we don't just have the JCVI now, we have the CCVAG, the Children's COVID Vaccine Advisory Group. And the government might listen to its yes men, but now parents have other people and other opinions to listen to. So that's why we're hosting this, that's why we're grateful for all the media that did show up, and that's why I'm sure we'll be doing similar things in the future.